Good evening, everyone. I'm really happy to see you all here. My name is Mahsa Ibrahimi. I'm an English teacher. I have the pleasure of hosting this session with you on Google Meet. The topic of the session is how to run conversation classes with Ms. Moqadam. The session that you're taking part in is brought to you by TTC, Teacher Training Center. We know that you've probably just arrived home from work, so the session will be about 60 minutes long. We've made sure to use this time to maximum. We will be sharing with you some ideas and tips that you can use straight away to make your techniques in having conversation classes easier. The session will be recorded, so if you've missed any of parts, you'll be soon able to catch up on our channel on YouTube, which I will share with you the link in the chat box. Before introducing Ms. Moqadam, I would like to give you some information on what else we still have to offer to you as parts of our teacher training programs. ttc.moqaddam.pro is our main social networking place where you can get access to a bank of various resources, including teaching tutorials, overseas job offers, free teaching resources, and free webinars. Please head over to our Instagram page to find out more about the options. Finally, you can find us on different platforms. If you have any questions, do not fail to get in touch with us through scanning the QR code on the screen using the camera on your phone. Our next teacher training program will be an online course on teaching very young and young learners, which will start in late September. You can visit our Instagram page to find more information about the course. There is a registration discount coupon awarded to you for taking part in this webinar. If interested, just keep in touch with us. And now I would like to introduce Ms. Moqaddam to you, who I'm sure most of you know. Good evening, Ms. Moqaddam. How are you doing?
Hi, Maxa. Happy to have you here.
So, well, Ms. Moqaddam is the founder of TTC, Teacher Training Center. She's an MA graduate in TEFL. She's also a certified CELTA, TESOL, and teacher trainer. She's been holding teacher training programs since 2017 in both online and on-site settings. Right now, she's a professor at Teacher Training College in Mashhad. Ms. Moqaddam, looking forward to your session.
Thank you, Mahsa. Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar. We are going to have a great time together, and I welcome everybody on board. And I'm going to just, first of all, let's thank Mahsa once again for hosting this session. I'm going to, because we've got only 60 minutes time, so I'm going to go straight to the first slide. I would like to ask you to actually turn off your videos and your mics so that it helps you to speed up your internet connection. So I should tell you that if there is any question during the webinar and during the session, you can just type it in the chat box, and the host will gather all of them in one place. And when it's time for question and answer, I will try to answer your questions in the session. So thank you for being here, and let's start the webinar. Okay, so um, I wish you are seeing the first slide. So before I start my presentation, let's elaborate a bit more on the title so that you catch up well with the ideas throughout the session. As the title says, this webinar will give you ideas on running conversation classes in particular. So if you are teaching a conversation as part of a lesson, alongside other parts of a lesson, for example, the reading, the grammar, the listening, you may need quite a different framework in those lessons. So here we go over those classes in which the main aim of the lesson is working on conversation. And I'm sure 100% that you have come across a lot of learners who come to you and who ask you for these kind of classes because they think these kind of classes are tailored enough to lead them to speak fluently in English. So let me tell you what I'm going to and what I hope to cover throughout the session. By the end of this webinar, I would like to cover the following areas in regarding to conversation classes. First, we go over the basic elements for running conversation classes. You will get to know about how and what to teach in these classes. Also, you will know about how these classes can be practically structured. And finally, as conversations normally are delivered in the form of communication between people, between two or three people. So we will compare the difference between role plays and simulations in particular. So let's start with the first part, which is the basics you need to know for running conversation classes. I should tell you that before planning for a conversation class, which is a class dedicated and designed specifically for teaching conversation, so it's not a general class, probably the one you have in your schedule, in your timetable. It's a class only for conversations. So it's good to get to know an overview of the main details of these kind of classes. So first, let's find out who can take part in these kind of classes. We need to assume that all the learners, the people who are going to take part in your class, have a basic knowledge of English. So they are not learning English from scratch, but they want to practice and improve what they have already know. So they are normally classed as pre-intermediate or intermediate learners. That means you need to make sure that they understand and speak simple English. So this class is not a class for absolute beginners. Teaching, why not? Why not for beginners? Because teaching beginners requires different actually strategies and skills. So based on CEF or CEFR, as it stands for Common European Framework of Reference, people who are coming to you for these kind of classes need to stand at the level of A2 and B1. For the next requirement, you need to find out, okay, how many of these learners, A2, B1 learners, are enough for a class? As a rule of thumb, a teacher, we teachers, we can usually manage a group of 6 learners, which sounds like public classes to you offered by language institutions. But even if you have a large class full of students, you can still start the class, the conversation class. But you need to have somebody like an assistant to help you for managing the class. Why you need an assistant for helping you in the class? Because the maximum of the class time in these kind of classes must be the speaking and from the learners. So you need somebody to help you to monitor how they are progressing at different stages of the class. So for this reason, you probably need an assistant, actually hire, mm, and to run the conversation classes. Um, in the next part, I'd like to tell you that, okay, you have your learners, and you know what levels they are. The question is that how often you should meet them, how often they need to have conversation classes. Ideally, you should meet your learners weekly. And why? Because if they do not meet you weekly, for example, if you have your classes every 2 weeks or every 1 week, they may lose fluency. And this is because they do not practice the language very often. So normally we have, in our context, we have 2 hours class in our context, which I'm telling you how you can manage 2 hours for the kind of classes which we call conversation classes. So 1 hour is probably the maximum of time for the learners, because they will get exhausted to speak in the target language for much than that. So if your class is fixed or planned or designed for 2 hours, you can plan for the second half of your class for the conversation, and in the first half of your class you probably make your learners ready for the conversation. What will you do in the first half of your class? You will go over a text, for example, which provides your learners the vocabulary, the pronunciation, and the structures. And more importantly, the topic knowledge they need so that they can get to talk in the second half of your class for speaking in the classroom. Okay, now let me tell you that why would we have the first half of the class for these kind of actually concepts? Because we are planning to make the context familiar and make the context ready so that they can think, they can talk, and they can communicate in the class. I sure that you are thinking on having both halves in your classes, because as usual, typically, we do not know much about the background of our learners. Probably they are not at the same level. Some of them know a lot, some of them know very less than the others. So that's why you try to make them all ready in the first half, and then you have the conversation time in the second half of your class. Now, finally, we have the learners. We know what levels they need to be. We know how often we should meet for making the conversation happen. The final question is that where should we hold the classes? The answer for those of you who are working in institutions and the class is offered to you by the institution is obvious. You hold it in a class of a language school. But sometimes you need to run these kind of classes as part of your own teaching business, which is awesome because you run your own business, you have your own learners, and it's quite independent from working with language schools. So if you are having your own classes, then you need to make sure that you have all you need in handy. But it really depends on what and how you typically deliver a lesson. So it depends on how you usually teach and what materials you typically use in your classes. For example, if you are a kind of teacher who uses the whiteboard quite a lot in the class, then for having these kind of classes, you definitely need a whiteboard in your class. So be careful about all the four requirements you need to consider before running a conversation class. In the next slide, which is the second part of the webinar, I'm going to tell you, actually in the next two slides, I'm going to tell you about the first, where you should find the lesson materials for conversation classes. And second, okay, what is a conversation lesson plan like? So let's start with the first part. Let's find out that where you should find the materials to use in your classes. I should tell you that this is not an easy job because it's not your taste of choice. You need to consider your learners, their needs. You need to analyze them, and then you go for choosing the right material for your classes. So there are three ways for finding materials for conversation classes. The first way is creating your own material, which is very creative. So you design your own material, and it's really a good idea to use subjects relevant to your culture or to the target culture, because they can get connected to the content of the class much easier. So in general, teach them about life in your country, in their country, or even in the target country. Uh, for finding this kind of information, you need to search the internet. And for finding the background information, you need to print it in the form of a text. And because we usually use text, but I'm going to tell you what else you need to have at this part of the lesson. So you print them in the form of a text, and we use it as a prompt to introduce the new vocabulary items, to practice the pronunciation of the vocabulary items, and also to give example sentences in the lesson. So the conversation will be based on the theme of the day. So there's a theme whenever you start a lesson, and they can talk about the topic because it is related to their own personal experiences. So the first way of finding materials for these kind of classes is very um, creative, but at the same time challenging, because it requires you to spend like hours for designing the tasks, and also the prompt, so that they get to ready for the information they're going to talk about in the conversation part, which we call the second half of the class. Another way for finding materials for these kind of classes is through downloading them, where definitely the internet. But please be careful that if you are going to download the materials for conversation classes, you need to adapt them for your own use based on your learners, their levels, and also the context you are teaching. So the title you need to Google could be very simple, such as conversational English free lesson plans. So if you search it like this, you will have thousands of results giving you some ideas and some materials for conversation classes. The last one, which is the easiest one for finding the materials, is buying materials, which I'm sure you have so far. You have been working on this one. You invest in course books because it's a really a good and huge time saver. And there are a large number of them that you can use for different levels, from beginners to advanced. And let me introduce you some of the course books, which is very popular. So if you just look at the textbooks I'm displaying on the screen, we have a Speaking Extra, we have a handbook of spoken grammar, we have Talk Time and Speak Now. Personally, I have tried working with the Speak Now from 1 to 4, and it is a wonderful book. I'm not sure if you have worked with any of these textbooks, but if you are not the kind of teacher who creates materials, or who downloads the materials, you can easily buy, first of all, go to the bookstore and try to look through the content of each book, the available books, the ones who are, which are in stock, and then choose the right course book for using in conversation classes. Okay, now I'm gonna show you how a framework looks like, how a lesson plan looks like when you go for conversation classes. First, let's start with the left hand side of this framework. You need to set the theme, as I told you before, so that they get to know the topic and they can just turn on what they already know about the topic. So in the first part, you need to set the theme. And I'm going to tell you even much more later on in this session. So you need, after that, so this is still the first half of your class, the first 1 hour of your class. You set the context, you set the theme, and then still at the same stage of your lesson, you need to pinch on some language points depending on what learners will need to use in their conversations. So probably the language points, some vocabulary items, some idioms, the pronunciation of them, and also, let's say, some specific grammatical structures. So whatever you use, we are still on the first hour of the lesson. But what you do in the next part is actually the second half of the lesson, which is the conversation part. And at this stage, the learners will need to use what they have got ready in their conversations. So they are there and they are speaking the target language based on the lesson theme we worked on in the first half of the class. Let me tell you that if you have any questions so far, you can easily type your question in the chat box, and I will let you know about the answers to the best of my effort. So let's go to the next part of the session, which in which I'm going to tell you about how you can structure a conversation class. So I should tell you that there are 3 stages to a conversation lesson, which means that you cannot have one framework for all the classes. So one size doesn't fit all. Let's focus on each of these 3 stages in turn, and I will look at some activities you can incorporate in each one. So the first stage of running a conversation class is introducing the topic of the theme for the day. How will you do that? You can do that with some kind of stimulus to set the scene. And how would you actually use the stimulus? The first one is written text. So you can use, as I told you before, you can use a short written text, but it shouldn't be very long. 500 words would be nice. So, but it is actually related to the topic. And also you can search for information for these kind of texts on the internet. So go to the internet and search for the information you need in the form of a short text so that you can use in your classes. But I should tell you that the text shouldn't be long, as I told you before. And also, let me just turn on this one. Okay, so the written text, I told you it shouldn't be long. And on the other hand, when you search it on the internet, you need to summarize it and you need to simplify it for the learners because you want to make sure that the sentences are short enough and you should avoid unnecessarily complicated grammatical structures. So when you are sure about all of them, so the text is short, it doesn't have complicated grammatical structures, and also it is not difficult for them to read and to go through. So you present it to the learners on a page, on a handout, with pictures probably, and with some questions, which we call comprehension questions at the bottom. So this is one way of introducing the topic of the session. So we use a short text, but we need to consider what features the text should have. Another item is using a video to play at the very beginning of the class so that you can introduce the topic of the session. Again, the video shouldn't be very long or it shouldn't incorporate lots of language, much language. And the video is usually a good option because the context and the visuals are enough for stimulus for learners to understand what is going on. Another item which can help you to set the context is the realia, and you can bring some physical objects to your class and the objects are definitely related to the topic of the session. For example, if you can see the picture, this is the picture of a mistletoe, which is related to Christmas, right? The holiday, the Christmas, and people have different things to do on Christmas holiday. So I will bring something like a mistletoe into the class because the topic is all about the Christmas holiday. And I'm going to tell them how mistletoe actually relates to this holiday. What is the story behind it so that they can talk about their own culture and what they have for special occasions. And they can bring it even for the class when it's the presentation time, even in the following session or so. And also another example for using realia in the class. For example, you are going to work on a sports, a kind of sport. So it's, let's say it's about tennis, playing tennis. So if you bring the rackets, for example, in the class, it can make a good connection to what it really is in real life. And also an old family photo, which is a great point for them to talk. Usually when we have classes and when we ask our learners to bring family photos to the class, we are planning to teach them about the family members, but they do have actually lots of photos related to different occasions and events. So for example, the topic is still about, I don't know, a holiday like the Christmas, and on Christmas holidays they take different photos and they are doing different things and they take the photos, they record the moments. So you can ask them to bring photos related to different occasions and they take them with themselves to the class and they talk about the occasion and they tell you about the story behind the photo. So it's not always about teaching them about the family members. You can use family photos in many different ways. Okay, and let's go to the fourth option, which is the guest. You can also bring in somebody else to your class as a guest speaker or a friend who you really know. So you let them meet and you let the speaker, the guest speaker, to talk about her or his experiences, perhaps again with a photo or with some realia he or she has brought to the class. So these are the first, actually, the things you can set the context, and setting the context is the first stage in running conversation classes as the framework and the structure of the class. In the second stage of running conversation classes, we need to actually introduce or even practice the key vocabulary or grammar structures. The key language for students uh, is probably sometimes actually the vocabulary they need to understand and they need to use afterwards. Sometimes it's the pronunciation of those vocabulary items. And finally, it's the grammar structures they need to actually know so that they can speak more fluently in the second half of the class and in this conversation part. But please be careful if you are going to actually teach them or pre-teach them about some vocabulary items and idioms. You need to find a way to show the meaning of the words. And I'm sure you know what ways there are for showing the meaning, like drawing a picture, showing them in a video or photo, or if you can point to them. So you use a realia to point to it so that you show them, you convey the meaning for them. And at the same time, you need to practice the pronunciation of the words. You probably ask them to repeat after you so that you model it for them. You invite them to say the word and you correct them if necessary and if they are just going the wrong way. And finally, the grammar structure. I should tell you that the class is not a grammar class. You just teach them the necessary grammar they need for the conversation part. So, for example, I'm going to give you an example. For example, the thing they are going to be actually the thing they need to use in the conversation part. For example, it's there is, there are. So on the whiteboard, you just write down an example sentence. For example, is there a closet in the bedroom? And then there are two optional answers: yes there is, no there isn't. So you don't necessarily need to explain and read lots of different grammatical structures. But at the same time, it is still a good idea to at least provide them the correct structures at this stage so that they get to practice before they just present it back to the class in the form of a conversation. And finally, we are going to go over the last stage of a conversation lesson, which is, there it is, the conversation stage. So what will you usually do in the conversation stage? This is the stage, let me tell you, teachers, this stage is the conversation. So this is where the students practically practice talking in English. So sometimes you need to just give them some discussion questions like the ones you can see on the screen. You use some discussion questions so that they get the idea of how asking and how answering the questions. But this is the speaking time for students, and please reduce TTT at this stage and let them speak because it's their turn and they need to speak more than the teacher. But let me give you some guidelines for the last stage of conversation classes when the students are working together to actually talk in the target language. The first actually guideline is the section, this section of the lesson is for the learners doing the most of talking. So please, if you are planning to correct them, make some notes and postpone it to a later time so that you do not hinder any communication. The second tip for this stage is you should use open questions when you want to prompt your learners to avoid simple yes or no answers. I know that there is a taboo in your classes that your students are not very willing to talk in the class. You ask them a question, they would come up with yes or no. So please ask them open questions so that they give you more answers. So keep the conversation going and provide different opportunities for the learners to give you longer answers. One actually solution, one remedy for these kind of problems in the class is asking your learners to relate the topic to their own life and to their own experiences. In this case, they usually actually have lots of talking to share with you because it's related to their life and what they usually do as their personal life. And finally, the final tip for running the conversation classes is keep the interruptions to a minimum. And what we usually do when we interrupt students, we want to correct them, right? So keep it to minimum and resist the urge to correct every single mistake they make and you hear, because this correction would stop them when they are just going through a natural flow of speech, and it would potentially intimidate your learners from speaking more. So let them know that it is okay at this stage to make mistakes, and I will let you know about the serious ones later on when you are done with the conversation. Okay, now we are going to the last part of this session, which we will talk about the role plays and simulations. I'm not sure if you know exactly the difference between role plays and simulations, but I'm going to give you a very short description on how they are different and how you can use them differently in your classes. I have two pictures on the screen for you. The one on the left is a role play, and the one on the right is a simulation. So we normally put students in pairs or groups to talk and practice the target language. In conversation classes in particular, um, this activity, this takes the form of a role play or simulations because it's the conversation and it usually happens between people. I'll go over some differences between the two models and you just decide for your ideal one, and please choose it based on your class type. So if you look at the pictures, you can see that both activities are speaking activities, but they have a bit different definitions. In role plays, the picture on the left, you put yourself into an imaginary situation. So it's not you, and you don't play yourself, but an imaginary person in an imaginary situation. And as you can see in the photo on the left, the learners are taking on roles and they have some cards, some pieces of papers to read from. Their behavior or even what they think is limited to what they have in their hands and on the papers. For example, a pilot talking to a customer at the front desk in the airport. So an imaginary person imaginary situation, and what is usually happening between a pilot talking to a customer. A very fixed and prefabricated phrases and speech between them. So this kind of activity, the role plays, they sound like more like an information gap activity. We have another definition for simulations. Again, it is an speaking activity, but in simulations, you put yourself in an imaginary situation. So it's your thinking, it's your opinion, but it's an imaginary situation. And as you can see in the photo on the right this time, the learners are not taking roles, they are taking turns. And there is no card in their hand, there is no paper, and they speak for themselves. And it sounds more like an opinion gap activity. Let me give you an example. For example, you, not a pilot, not a chef, not a doctor, not a teacher. You are talking to a receptionist in a hotel. Whatever comes to your mind would be asked in the situation. One more thing about role plays and simulations is that for using either role plays or simulations, you need to go through some steps to meet the aim of the task. Let me show you what steps there are for each one. The first one, if you are planning to use the role plays in your conversation classes, the first three steps is very common and very obvious because we've been talking about the first three stages of running conversation classes earlier on this session. So you build the context, you set the theme of the session, you teach or pre-teach them some vocabulary items and also the pronunciation of them if they are just saying them wrong. And also you teach them about some specific grammar or structures they will need to use in the second half of the class, which we call the conversation part. But there is the last two steps are a bit different from simulation. So the first three steps are the same for both role plays and simulations, but the last two steps are a bit different. For doing role plays, you need to give them some preparation time. You tell them what is the story, who you are, what is the situation, and what kind of communication should happen between you in the role play. So you need to give them some time in the session. They get ready and they go over it, and they have another time while they are doing the role play for the whole class, or even when they are working in their actually closed pairs. So they have some reminding or reminder look time when they just look at the papers in their hands, and if they just missed something, they take a look and they come back to the role play. So the preparation time happens in the class, and they have this chance of looking at the paper and just getting to know what to say next. But in simulations, you have the first three steps, building the context, working on vocabulary items, and teaching them some structures to use in the conversation. But the last two steps are a bit different from role plays. For preparation time, because it's a real event, a real happening, you need to probably sometimes, based on the topic, you need to give them time to work and to prepare even before the class. So the preparation time doesn't usually happen in the class. Sometimes it needs to be happen before the class. They need to think about the situation and what they need to say for different occasions. And also there is a feedback for simulations. The teacher goes to different groups and different pairs, and they come up with some feedback on the way they are presenting, actually, the way they are working in the world play. So as I told you, sometimes have you need to have actually a feedback time. And for having this feedback, you need to have an assistant for giving the feedback, because there are lots of groups, lots of pairs. You need to go over different groups and you need to come up with feedback for each group. So sometimes you need an assistant for large classes to help you in this case. And we are going to the last part of this webinar, which is the questions. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat box and I will read them, and to my best I will try to answer your questions. I'm just waiting for the questions to show up in the chat box, and if you don't have any questions right now, you can just post them in the group I have made earlier, and I will answer them back in 2 or 3 hours before I close the group up. So any questions, everybody? Who should be the assistant? An assistant shouldn't be your friend who is not actually a teacher. You need to have an assistant who knows about the stages of teaching a conversation class or even teaching English in general. So try to have an assistant in this community. And also, it is a very great idea to work with your actually colleagues in the form of new communities. When you work on like projects together and you come up with great ideas as a group of 2 or 3. So the consequences for running these kind of classes or any kind of classes in the form of 2 teachers, 3 teachers in a class would be fantastic, because both of you are going to benefit from the reflects of the teaching of each other. Thank you, Sarah, for asking the question. Thank you, Malika, for having us. Okay, so if there is no question, I would like to tell you that this is officially the end of the webinar, and there is a QR code on the screen right now. If you just turn on your camera on the cell phone, and if you just scan it, you can get access to a website. The website is called Teacher Training Center. And in the website, you can find different links to our social networking like Instagram, LinkedIn, which is my own profile. You can get to know me more there. And also you can get to know about our Telegram channel, a direct link for texting and calling through WhatsApp. And also there is another link for the YouTube channel where the recording of the session will be saved there for watching later on. So Mahsa, I'm officially done. And if there is anything you need to do, I'm just waiting for you to join us back. Okay, everybody. Now I'm waiting for the host to come back, but if you need to leave the session, that was a wonderful time getting to know you and having you in this webinar. Thank you very much. I'm waiting for the host to come back, but if you need to leave, that's fine. You can go, and thanks for coming and goodbye.
Brilliant, Ms. Moqadam. Thank you for your practical ideas on how to teach and run conversation classes. Just to summarize and remind you of what I presented at the beginning of the session, if you check our Instagram page, you can find free teaching resources on a regular basis. Just scan the QR code on the screen. There is an attendance certification which will be emailed to you for a week time. So thank you, Ms. Moqaddam. Thank you, everyone, for joining this session. Hopefully, see you all again in upcoming webinars.
Thank you, Mahsa. It was a great pleasure having you with us in this webinar. Thank you, everybody, and hope to see you again in future and upcoming programs by Teacher Training Center. Thank you so much and good time.